City's most eligible bachelor ignored all the rich women, but a flower seller's smile changed everything. Hello, viewer. Thanks for joining us. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. The elevator doors slid open with the whispered precision that only came with German engineering and a maintenance contract worth more than most people's annual salaries. Justin Adams stepped into the marble and glass cathedral of his penthouse office, 37 floors above the chaos of downtown Chicago. The morning sun carved sharp angles through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting everything in that golden light that photographers paid fortunes to recreate. His assistant, Margaret, a woman whose efficiency bordered on the supernatural, was already at her desk despite the early hour. She'd been with the company for 12 years, had seen him through 3 major acquisitions and countless late nights, and still addressed him as Mr. Adams with the formality of a diplomat. "Good morning, Mr. Adams. The Singapore contracts are on your desk for final review. The Peterson merger meeting has been moved to 10:30, and your mother called 3 times before 8 a.m. Justin loosened his tie, Italian silk, custom-made, probably cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month, and felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle across his shoulders like an expensive coat that never quite fit right. What did she want this time? The usual. The charity gala is next month, and she needs to know if you're bringing anyone. I quote, "a suitable someone who won't embarrass the family name." He walked past Margaret's desk toward his office, a space that had been featured in Architectural Digest twice and still felt as welcoming as a museum display. "I'll tell her I'll be there alone, as always." She won't like that answer. She never does. Justin's office occupied the corner of the building, offering a view that real estate agents described as commanding and inspiring. To him, it mostly looked like a very expensive cage, the city spread out below him like a circuit board, all organized lines and calculated intersections. Somewhere down there, people were living real lives, making real connections, finding real meaning in their days. He'd built Adams Enterprises from the ground up, starting with a single software contract in his garage at 22. 14 years later, the company employed over 3,000 people across 4 continents. The business magazines called him a visionary. The society pages called him eligible. His therapist, during their brief and ultimately futile sessions, had called him emotionally unavailable. The Singapore contracts lay spread across his desk like battle plans, numbers and clauses that would determine the next phase of expansion into Asian markets. Important work, meaningful work, in the abstract way that creating jobs and generating revenue was meaningful. But as he picked up his Mont Blanc pen, another expensive object that served the same function as a $10 bic, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was just rearranging deck chairs on a very luxurious ship that wasn't actually going anywhere he wanted to be. His phone buzzed, a text from his brother David in San Francisco. "Saw your picture in Forbes again. When are you going to find someone who can put up with your workaholic tendencies and terrible taste in ties?" Justin glanced down at the tie in question. Hermès, dark blue with a subtle pattern that probably had some pretentious French name. David was right about one thing. His taste in ties was questionable at best. But then, when you could afford to spend $5,000 on a piece of silk, the actual aesthetics became secondary to the statement it made. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent so many years building wealth that he'd forgotten how to build anything else. Relationships came and went with the predictable rhythm of quarterly reports. Women entered his life attracted to the lifestyle, the status, the possibilities that came with being connected to Justin Adams. They lasted until they realized that the man behind the empire was far less interesting than the empire itself. Margaret's voice came through the intercom. Mr. Adams, Peterson is here early for the 10:30. Send him in. Harold Peterson was everything Justin expected from old Chicago money: silver hair, impeccable posture, and the kind of confidence that came from never having to prove yourself to anyone. The merger they were discussing would add Peterson's logistics network to Adams' Enterprises' growing portfolio, a move that made perfect sense on paper and would probably earn Justin another cover story in Fortune magazine. "Justin, you look tired," Peterson said, settling into the leather chair across from the desk. "All work and no play, as they say. The Singapore expansion has been keeping me busy." "That's exactly what I'm talking about. You're 36 years old, son. When I was your age, I was married with 2 kids and still finding time to enjoy life. You can't take this success with you to the grave." Justin signed the contracts with mechanical precision. Success requires sacrifice. Success requires balance. Speaking of which, I was talking to Victoria Thornfield at the club last week. Beautiful woman, impressive family, doctorate from Northwestern. She asked about you. Victoria Thornfield. Justin remembered her from various social functions. Tall, elegant, with the kind of polished beauty that photographed well, and the sort of conversation that hit all the right notes without ever saying anything particularly memorable. She would fit perfectly into his world, complement his lifestyle, enhance his social standing. The thought made him feel inexplicably tired. "I'm not really looking for anything serious right now," he said. Peterson laughed, the hearty sound of a man who'd never questioned whether his life was meaningful. "You've been saying that for years. What are you waiting for, son? Lightning to strike." After Peterson left, Justin found himself standing at the windows again, looking down at the ant-like figures moving through the streets below. From this height, everyone looked the same, small, purposeful, but ultimately insignificant. He wondered if that's how other people saw him. Another figure in an expensive suit, moving through his own predictable patterns, significant only in the abstract way that money made people significant. His phone rang. David again. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday," his brother said without preamble, "about Mom's expectations and the family legacy and all that pressure she puts on you. I don't want to talk about Mom right now." "Fair enough. But I want to tell you something. Sarah and I had dinner with the Hendersons last night. You remember Jim from college? And he was talking about how he met his wife. It wasn't at some charity function or through mutual friends in their social circle. He was having a terrible day. His car broke down in the rain, and she was the tow truck driver who showed up. She was covered in grease, cursing like a sailor, and completely unimpressed by his BMW. He said it was the first time in years someone had treated him like a regular person instead of a walking bank account. Justin could hear children laughing in the background of the call, the sounds of a real home with real life happening inside it. "What's your point?" "My point is that maybe you're looking in the wrong places. Maybe the person you need to meet isn't going to be at the country club or the opera opening. Maybe she's going to be someone who doesn't know your net worth or care about your social status." "That's a nice sentiment, David, but it's not practical. I can't exactly pretend to be middle class." "I'm not suggesting you pretend to be anything. I'm suggesting you try being yourself instead of being Justin Adams, CEO. Remember when we were kids, how you used to talk about wanting to make a difference, about building something that mattered?" I have built something that matters. The company employs thousands of people. That's not what I mean, and you know it. After the call ended, Justin sat in the leather chair that probably cost more than most people's cars and tried to remember the last time he'd had a conversation that wasn't about business, social obligations, or family expectations. He couldn't. The afternoon passed in the familiar rhythm of meetings, phone calls, and decisions that felt important in the moment but would probably be forgotten by next quarter. By 5:30, the office had emptied except for Margaret, who never left before he did, and the security staff who maintained their invisible presence throughout the building. "You should go home, Margaret." "I'll lock up." She looked at him with the expression of a woman who'd been managing his schedule long enough to recognize the signs. "Mr. Adams, when was the last time you took a real weekend off? Not working from home, not being on call for emergencies, actually off?" "I don't remember." "That's exactly what I was afraid you'd say." After she left, Justin found himself alone in the expensive silence of his office. The city lights were beginning to twinkle on as evening settled over Chicago, transforming the view into something that belonged on a postcard. Beautiful and distant and ultimately empty. He thought about Peterson's words, about David's suggestion, about the string of relationships that had started with promise and ended in polite disappointment. Women who wanted to be seen with Justin Adams, but who never seemed particularly interested in knowing who he was when the suit came off and the business facade dropped away. Maybe the problem wasn't them. Maybe the problem was that he'd forgotten who he was underneath all the success and status. Maybe he'd become so good at being the person everyone expected him to be that he'd lost track of the person he actually was. The thought was unsettling enough that he decided to walk home instead of calling his driver. The evening air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and the streets were alive with the kind of energy that only came when people were finished with work and beginning their real lives. He walked north from the Loop, past the restaurants where young couples shared intimate dinners, past the bars where groups of friends celebrated the end of another week, past the small shops and cafes that stayed open late for people who didn't measure their success by the square footage of their offices. 3 blocks from his apartment building, he noticed the flower stand. It was small and unpretentious, set up on the corner of a busy intersection where commuters hurried past on their way to train stations and parking garages. The woman behind the counter was arranging bouquets with the focused attention of someone who took pride in her work, even if that work didn't require an MBA or generate quarterly reports. She was probably in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and clothes that suggested function over fashion. Her hands moved quickly and surely among the flowers, creating arrangements that somehow managed to be both simple and elegant. There was something about her concentration, her obvious skill and care that made him slow his pace. As he approached, she looked up, and he found himself meeting the most direct gaze he'd encountered in years. No calculation behind her eyes, no assessment of his worth or potential usefulness, just a straightforward acknowledgement of his presence. "Help you with something?" she asked. Her voice had a slight rasp to it, like someone who'd spent time outdoors and wasn't afraid to speak her mind. Justin realized he was staring and tried to recover his composure. "I was just admiring your work. The arrangements are beautiful." She glanced at the flowers she'd been working on, then back at him, with the expression that suggested she was trying to figure out if he was being genuine or just making conversation. "Thanks. Most people just walk by without noticing." "Their loss," she smiled at that, a real smile that reached her eyes and transformed her face completely. "You're not from around here, are you?" "What makes you say that?" "The tie, for one thing." She nodded toward his chest with an expression of barely suppressed amusement. "That thing probably cost more than I make in a month, and you're wearing it to walk around the neighborhood at 7 p.m. on a Tuesday." Justin looked down at the Hermès silk that had seemed so appropriate in the boardroom that morning. In the context of this street corner, surrounded by the honest simplicity of her flower stand, it suddenly looked ridiculous, pretentious, like a costume he'd forgotten he was wearing. "You think it's too much? I think it's perfect if you're trying to look like someone who takes himself very seriously." She was definitely fighting back laughter now. But if you're trying to look like someone who belongs in this neighborhood, you might want to lose the designer armor. Designer armor. The phrase hit him with unexpected accuracy. That's exactly what it was. Protection against being seen as anything other than successful, wealthy, important. He'd been wearing armor so long he'd forgotten there was a person underneath it. "Fair point," he said, and surprised himself by loosening the tie and pulling it off entirely. "Better?" She studied him with the same focused attention she'd given to the flowers. "Much! You actually look human now, as opposed to what I looked like before. Like a magazine ad for whatever it is that rich guys are supposed to want." He found himself laughing, a genuine sound that felt rusty from disuse. "That's probably the most honest assessment anyone's given me in years. Most people probably don't tell you the truth about much, do they?" The observation was casual, but it landed with the precision of a scalpel finding exactly the right spot. "No," he said quietly, "they don't." She was quiet for a moment, her hands still busy with the flowers, but her attention clearly on him. That must get lonely. The simple empathy in her voice caught him off guard. Not pity, not judgment, just recognition of a truth he'd been avoiding for longer than he cared to admit. "Sometimes," he said. "Well, if it makes you feel any better, I don't know who you are or what you do or how much money you have, so I have no reason not to tell you the truth. It does make me feel better, actually." She finished the arrangement she'd been working on, white roses mixed with something green and fragrant that he couldn't identify, and held it up for inspection. "What do you think?" "It's beautiful, simple, but elegant. That's the goal. People think flower arranging is about adding more and more until you have something elaborate and impressive. But the best arrangements are about knowing what to leave out, about finding the essential elements and letting them speak for themselves." As she spoke, Justin found himself thinking about his own life, about all the elaborate additions and impressive complications he'd accumulated over the years. When was the last time he'd focused on the essential elements? When was the last time he'd let anything speak for itself without his careful management and control? "You're thinking about something else," she observed. "Sorry, what you said about essential elements just resonated." "Good. That means you're still capable of learning." She handed him the arrangement. "Here, take this." "I couldn't." "You could, and you should. Consider it payment for the entertainment value of watching someone realize their tie is ridiculous." He accepted the flowers, feeling slightly ridiculous himself, but also oddly pleased. "I don't even know your name." "Ariana Baker." She extended a hand with the straightforward confidence of someone who'd never learned to be anything other than herself. And you are?" For a moment, he considered giving her the full introduction. Justin Adams, CEO of Adams Enterprises, as featured in Forbes and Fortune and whatever other magazines were currently interested in his business strategy. But something about her direct gaze and honest manner made him want to try a different approach. "Justin," he said simply. "Well, Justin, it's been educational. Come back sometime when you're not wearing armor, and maybe we can have a real conversation." He walked the remaining 3 blocks to his apartment building with the flowers in one hand and his expensive tie draped over his arm like a flag of surrender. The doorman, trained to maintain professional discretion in all circumstances, managed not to comment on the unusual sight of Mr. Adams arriving with a bouquet from a street-corner flower stand. In his apartment, a space that had been featured in Metropolitan Home and still felt as impersonal as a hotel suite, he found a vase and arranged the flowers as best he could. They looked small and out of place among the expensive furniture and carefully curated art, but they also brought something into the room that had been missing: life, authenticity. the kind of simple beauty that couldn't be purchased or planned. He thought about Ariana's words as he got ready for bed, about essential elements and knowing what to leave out, about the difference between being human and looking like a magazine ad, about the loneliness of being surrounded by people who never told him the truth. For the first time in years, he fell asleep thinking about someone other than business strategies and quarterly projections. He thought about dark hair caught in evening light, about hands that moved with such sure skill among the flowers, about a smile that had reached her eyes and transformed her entire face. He thought about what it might be like to have a real conversation with someone who saw him as Justin instead of Justin Adams, CEO. The next morning, Margaret noticed immediately that something was different. Maybe it was the slightly loosened collar, or the way he seemed less rigidly focused on the schedule she'd prepared, or simply the fact that he'd brought coffee for both of them instead of expecting her to handle such details. "Good morning, Mr. Adams. You seem refreshed. I walked home last night instead of taking the car. It was nice to see the neighborhood." She made a note in her ever-present planner. "And should I arrange for the driver to pick you up later in the evenings, or would you prefer to continue walking?" "I think I'll continue walking, at least when the weather's good." The morning proceeded with the usual rhythm of meetings and phone calls, but Justin found his attention drifting periodically to the flowers on his desk. Margaret had noticed them, of course. Margaret noticed everything, but had maintained her professional discretion about their obvious street vendor origins. Around noon, during a brief break between conference calls, she knocked on his office door with an expression of barely controlled curiosity. "Mr. Adams, your mother called again about the charity gala. Let me guess. She has another suitable candidate for me to meet. Actually, she wanted to know if you'd given any more thought to Victoria Thornfield. Apparently, Mrs. Thornfield mentioned you at some social function, and your mother took that as a positive sign." Justin thought about Victoria Thornfield's polished beauty and cultivated conversation, then found himself comparing it to Ariana's direct gaze and unpretentious manner. The contrast was striking enough to be almost comical. "I tell her I'm still not interested in being set up. She won't like that answer." "She never does," he said, echoing their conversation from the previous day. But this time, the familiar script felt less like resignation and more like a choice. The afternoon dragged in a way that was unusual for him. Normally, he could lose himself completely in the details of running a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. Today, he found himself checking the clock more frequently than usual, aware of the minutes passing with uncharacteristic impatience. By 5:30, he'd made his decision. "Margaret, I'm heading out early tonight. Should I reschedule the Henderson call?" "Move it to tomorrow morning." "And Margaret," he paused at her desk, suddenly feeling like a teenager asking permission for something he wasn't sure he should want. "If anyone asks where I am, just say I'm in a meeting." She looked at him with the expression of someone who'd been managing his schedule long enough to recognize when he was about to do something uncharacteristic. "Of course, Mr. Adams, enjoy your evening." The walk to Ariana's flower stand felt different than his usual purposeful strides through the city. Less destination-focused, more like an exploration. He found himself noticing details he'd missed the night before, the way the late afternoon light caught the windows of the apartment buildings, the sounds of dinner preparation drifting from open doors, the easy familiarity between neighbors who'd built real communities in these streets. She was there, of course, arranging what looked like a completely different selection of flowers than she'd had the day before. Today's arrangements featured deep oranges and burgundies, autumn colors that somehow managed to be both bold and subtle at the same time. "Well, look who's back," she said without looking up from her work. And without the offensive tie, "I notice. I took your advice about the armor. Smart man. She finished the arrangement she'd been working on and looked up at him with that same direct gaze that had unsettled him so much the day before. Today, it felt less challenging and more welcoming. "How did the flowers work out?" "They're beautiful. I put them on my desk at work, bringing a little life into the corporate environment." "Something like that." She studied him for a moment, her hands still busy with the flowers, but her attention clearly focused on his face. "You look different today, I don't know, less like you're trying to prove something." The observation was so accurate, it was almost uncomfortable. "Maybe I'm getting tired of trying to prove things. That's usually when life gets interesting." A customer approached, an older man looking for something for his wife's birthday, and Justin stepped aside to let Ariana work. He watched her interact with the customer, noting the easy way she asked questions about his wife's preferences, her genuine interest in creating something that would make someone happy. There was no artifice in her manner, no calculation about what would generate the best profit margin, just honest craftsmanship and a desire to do good work. After the customer left with a cheerful bouquet of yellow and pink flowers, Ariana turned back to Justin with an expression of mild curiosity. "So what do you do, Justin? And please don't tell me you're in corporate consulting or financial services or something equally soul-crushing." He found himself hesitating, not because he was ashamed of his work, but because he wasn't sure how to explain it without sounding like exactly the kind of person she'd been mocking the day before. "I run a company, technology and logistics, mostly." That's sufficiently vague to suggest it's either very boring or very important. Which is it? "Probably both." She laughed, the same genuine sound that had struck him so forcefully the night before. "At least you're honest. Most people try to make their jobs sound more interesting than they actually are." "And what about you? Have you always been in the flower business?" "For the last 3 years. Before that, I was a teacher." "What grade?" "High school, English literature." Her expression grew slightly more serious. "I loved it, actually. There's something amazing about watching kids discover that words can be powerful, that stories can change how you see the world." "Why did you leave?" "Budget cuts. The district eliminated half the English positions, and I was one of the newer teachers." She shrugged, but he could see the disappointment she was trying to hide. "So I decided to try something completely different. Turns out I have a knack for flowers." "But you miss teaching every day." The admission seemed to surprise her. "I don't usually tell people that. Most folks assume I must be happier working for myself, being my own boss, all that entrepreneurial spirit nonsense. But the truth is, I'd go back to teaching tomorrow if I could afford to take the pay cut." The honesty in her voice made him want to tell her something equally true about himself. "Can I tell you something? I built my company from nothing, and I'm supposed to be proud of what I've accomplished. But some days I wake up and wonder if I'm actually making anything better, or just moving money around in more complicated ways." That's the first thing you've said that sounds like it came from a real person instead of a business magazine interview. "Maybe that's because you're the first person I've talked to in years who isn't trying to get something from me." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Oh, dude, what makes you think I'm not trying to get something from you?" "Are you?" "Well, I wouldn't mind selling you some flowers." The practical response made him laugh. "I think I can manage that." He ended up buying 3 arrangements, one for his office, one for his apartment, and one that he couldn't really justify but somehow wanted anyway. As Ariana wrapped them carefully in brown paper, he found himself reluctant to leave. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Shoot. Yesterday, when you said I looked lonely, how did you know?" She paused in her wrapping, considering the question with the same focused attention she gave to her flower arrangements. "I guess because you looked like someone who'd forgotten how to just be present in a moment. Like you were always thinking about the next thing, the next obligation, the next performance you had to give. That's exhausting. And exhausting is usually just another word for lonely. The insight was so precise, it took his breath away. You're very observant. It's an occupational hazard. When you're standing on a street corner all day, you get good at reading people. Most folks are so wrapped up in their own thoughts, they don't even see the flowers, let alone the person selling them. But sometimes someone stops and actually looks, and you can tell they're searching for something they can't name. And what do you think I'm searching for? Same thing everyone's searching for. A reason to believe that what they're doing matters. Someone who sees them for who they are instead of what they represent. A life that feels real instead of just successful. As he walked home with his arms full of flowers, Justin realized that Ariana had managed to articulate something he'd been feeling for years but had never been able to put into words. The difference between a successful life and a real life. The difference between being seen for what he'd accomplished and being known for who he was. That night, he arranged the flowers throughout his apartment, and for the first time in memory, the expensive space felt like it might actually become a home. He thought about calling David to tell him about meeting Ariana, but he wasn't sure how to explain what had happened. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would make sense as the beginning of a story. Just a conversation with a woman who sold flowers and told the truth and seemed to see something in him that he'd forgotten was there. Instead, he found himself doing something he hadn't done in years, sitting in his living room without the television on, without his laptop open, without any agenda or objective other than simply being present in the moment. The flowers filled the space with subtle fragrance, and the city lights twinkled beyond his windows like distant stars. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt like he might be exactly where he was supposed to be. The next few days fell into a pattern that would have surprised anyone who knew Justin's usual routine. Each evening, he found a reason to walk past Ariana's flower stand. Sometimes he bought flowers, sometimes he just stopped to talk. Their conversations ranged from literature to business, to the small observations about city life that somehow felt more significant than the million-dollar decisions he made during his regular work day. She recommended books, authors he'd never heard of who wrote about ordinary people finding extraordinary meaning in everyday life. He found himself reading during his lunch breaks, something he hadn't done since college, losing himself in stories that had nothing to do with profit margins or market expansion. Margaret noticed the change, of course. The flowers that appeared regularly on his desk, the slightly more relaxed way he handled the constant stream of meetings and phone calls, the fact that he'd started leaving the office at reasonable hours instead of staying until the security staff began their evening rounds. "Mr. Adams," she said one afternoon as he prepared to leave at 5:30. "I don't want to pry, but you seem happier lately." "Do I? More present, I suppose. Less like you're going through the motions." The observation echoed something Ariana had said about being present in the moment, and he wondered if the change was really that obvious, or if Margaret was simply more perceptive than he'd given her credit for. "Maybe I am," he said. "Well, whatever you're doing, keep doing it. It suits you." That evening, he found Ariana closing up the flower stand earlier than usual. The autumn air had turned crisp, and she was wearing a jacket that looked like it had seen several seasons of outdoor work. "Slow day?" he asked. "Cold day?" People don't think about flowers when the temperature drops. They start thinking about staying warm and getting home to dinner. She finished packing up the unsold arrangements with efficient movements. "What about you? Early escape from the corporate tower? Something like that?" She looked at him with that directness he'd come to expect and value. "Justin, can I ask you something?" Of course. Why do you keep coming by here? I mean, I enjoy our conversations, but you don't strike me as someone who needs this many flowers. The question had been lurking in the back of his mind for days, and he still wasn't sure he had a good answer. Honestly, because talking to you is the most real thing that happens in my day. Real how? You don't want anything from me. You're not trying to impress me or get me to sign something or invest in something or attend something. You just talk to me like I'm a person instead of a business opportunity. She was quiet for a moment, her hands still busy with the closing up routine, but her attention clearly on his words. That must be a pretty lonely way to live. It is. So what are you going to do about it? The question hung in the air between them, more complex than it seemed on the surface. What was he going to do about the loneliness, about the sense that his successful life was somehow missing its essential elements, about the growing realization that he wanted something he couldn't buy or acquire or strategically plan? I don't know, he said finally. I've never been good at anything that couldn't be solved with hard work and careful planning. Maybe that's your problem. Some things can't be solved. They can only be lived. As she spoke, Justin found himself looking at her, really looking, in a way he hadn't allowed himself before. The practical ponytail that always seemed to be coming slightly undone, the clothes that prioritized function over fashion, the hands that showed the honest wear of someone who worked with them every day. She was beautiful, but not in the polished, careful way of the women who moved through his usual social circles. Her beauty was direct and unpretentious, like everything else about her. "Ariana," he said, surprising himself with the sudden decision. "Would you like to have dinner with me?" She looked up from her packing with an expression of mild surprise. "Like a date?" "Like two people who enjoy talking to each other, sharing a meal. That's a pretty diplomatic way to avoid the word date. I'm still learning how to have conversations that aren't diplomatic." She smiled at that, the genuine expression that always seemed to light up her entire face. "Okay, Justin, I'll have dinner with you. But somewhere normal, okay? No places that require reservations made weeks in advance or wine lists that cost more than my rent." "I know just the place." The restaurant he chose was a small Italian place in her neighborhood, the kind of family-owned establishment that had been serving the same recipes for 3 generations. The tables were covered with red checkered cloths, the walls were lined with photographs of regular customers, and the owner greeted newcomers like they were old friends returning after a long absence. Ariana looked around the space with obvious pleasure. Now this is more like it. Actual character instead of decorator character. They were seated at a corner table that gave them privacy without isolation, and Justin found himself relaxing in a way that usually only happened in his own apartment. The atmosphere was warm and unpretentious, the kind of place where conversations happen naturally instead of being carefully managed. "So," Ariana said after they'd ordered, "tell me something about yourself that isn't related to business." "That's harder than it sounds." "Try." He thought for a moment, trying to remember aspects of himself that existed outside the carefully constructed professional identity he'd been maintaining for so many years. "I used to play piano, classical music, mostly. I was actually pretty good at it." "Used to?" "I stopped in college. Business school didn't leave much time for music, and after that, there always seemed to be something more important to focus on." He paused, surprised by how much he missed it now that he was talking about it. "I still have the piano in my apartment, but I can't remember the last time I played it." "That's sad." "Is it?" "Yes. Music isn't something you do because it's practical or profitable. It's something you do because it feeds some part of you that nothing else can reach. When you give that up, you lose a piece of yourself." The observation was uncomfortably accurate. "What about you? What feeds the part of you that nothing else can reach?" "Books, poetry, especially. There's something about the way poets can take ordinary words and arrange them so they mean something completely different, something deeper. It's like flower arranging, in a way. Finding the essential elements and letting them speak for themselves. Do you write? I used to. Before I became practical and focused on survival, she laughed, but there was a note of regret in it. See? We're both guilty of abandoning the things that made us feel alive. Their food arrived. Simple, honest Italian cooking that tasted like it had been made by someone who cared about the result rather than the profit margin. They ate and talked about books, about music, about the small details of daily life that somehow felt more significant than the big decisions that usually occupied Justin's attention. "Can I tell you something?" Ariana said, as they shared a piece of tiramisu that was probably made fresh that morning. "When you first started showing up at my flower stand, I thought you were probably another bored rich guy looking for some kind of authentic experience to spice up your privileged life. What changed your mind? You kept coming back, and each time, you seemed a little less like you were performing and a little more like you were just being yourself. That's not something you can fake for very long. I'm still figuring out who myself actually is. That's okay. Most people spend their whole lives figuring that out. The difference is whether you're brave enough to keep looking, or whether you just settle for being whoever other people expect you to be." As they walked back toward her neighborhood after dinner, Justin felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the simple pleasure of spending time with someone without any agenda beyond the enjoyment of their company. No networking opportunities to pursue, no strategic relationships to maintain, no careful impression management required. "Thank you," he said, as they reached the corner where her flower stand usually sat during the day. "For what?" "For seeing something in me worth talking to, for being real with me, for reminding me that there are parts of life that have nothing to do with business." She looked at him with that direct gaze he'd come to value so much. "Justin, can I tell you something?" "Of course. You don't need to thank me for treating you like a human being. That should be the baseline, not the exception." The simple truth of her words hit him with unexpected force. Somewhere along the way, he'd become so accustomed to transactional relationships that basic human decency felt like a gift. "You're right," he said quietly. "That's probably the saddest thing about my life. I've been grateful for normal treatment because I'd forgotten what normal felt like. Well, now you remember. The question is what you're going to do with that memory." That night, Justin sat at his piano for the first time in years. His fingers were stiff and unpracticed, and he could only remember fragments of pieces he'd once played perfectly. But there was something deeply satisfying about creating sound and melody with his own hands, about engaging with something that had no practical purpose beyond the simple human need for beauty and expression. He thought about Ariana's words about feeding the parts of yourself that nothing else could reach. He thought about essential elements and letting them speak for themselves. He thought about the difference between a successful life and a real life. For the first time in years, he was beginning to understand what he'd been missing. The October board meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. on a Tuesday that dawned grey and cold, with the kind of persistent drizzle that made Chicago feel like a city under siege. Justin arrived at the Adams Enterprises headquarters an hour early, as was his habit, but instead of diving immediately into final preparations, he found himself standing at his office windows, watching the morning commuters hurry past 37 floors below. From this height, they looked like anonymous figures in a carefully choreographed dance, each following their predetermined path with practiced efficiency. A month ago, he would have seen them as evidence of the productive energy that drove the city's economy. Today, he found himself wondering about their individual stories, their private dreams, the moments of real connection that made their lives meaningful beyond their professional obligations. Margaret arrived with coffee and the morning briefing, her efficiency undiminished by the early hour or the gloomy weather. "Good morning, Mr. Adams. The board materials are on your desk." Peterson confirmed his attendance despite the weather. "And your mother called to remind you about the charity gala this weekend." "Of course she did. She also mentioned that Victoria Thornfield will be attending, and she hopes you'll make an effort to spend some time with her." Justin felt the familiar weight of family expectations settling across his shoulders like an expensive coat that had never quite fit properly. "Tell her I'll be appropriately social." She won't be satisfied with that answer. She never is. The board meeting proceeded with the predictable rhythm of quarterly reports, strategic updates, and careful discussions of market expansion opportunities. The Singapore deal was progressing ahead of schedule. The European division was exceeding projected revenues, and the logistics acquisition they'd completed 6 months earlier was already generating the synergies Justin had promised the investors. By every measurable standard, Adams Enterprises was performing at the peak of its capabilities. The numbers were excellent, the strategic position was strong, and the future looked bright with opportunities for continued growth and profitability. So why did Justin feel like he was sleepwalking through his own success? "Outstanding work as always, Justin," Harold Peterson said as the meeting concluded. The older man had been on the board since the company's early expansion phase, and his approval carried weight with the other directors. "Though your leadership continues to drive exceptional results." "Thank you, Harold. I was talking to Victoria Thornfield at the club yesterday," Peterson continued, his tone carefully casual. "Lovely woman. She mentioned seeing you at some social function recently." Justin couldn't remember seeing Victoria at any recent social functions, but then most of those events blended together in his memory like a series of expensive, well-choreographed performances. "She did. She seemed quite interested in your work with the company. Sharp woman, understands business. She'd make an excellent partner for someone in your position." The word partner hung in the air with unmistakable implication. Justin had heard similar suggestions countless times over the years, always delivered with the assumption that his personal life should be managed with the same strategic thinking he applied to business decisions. "And I'm sure she would," he said diplomatically. After the board members left, Justin found himself alone in his office with the quarterly reports and the familiar sense that he was trapped in a life that looked perfect from the outside but felt increasingly hollow from the inside. The Singapore expansion would open new markets and create hundreds of jobs. The logistics integration would improve efficiency and reduce costs for clients across 3 continents. The strategic initiatives he was developing would position the company for continued growth well into the next decade. All of it mattered. All of it was important work that generated real value for real people. So why did it feel like he was just moving pieces around on a board game that had lost its ability to engage his imagination? Margaret knocked on his door with an expression that suggested she'd been observing his mood and had reached some conclusions about its cause. "Mr. Adams, your schedule is clear until the 2 o'clock call with the Frankfurt office. Perhaps you'd like to take a walk. The rain has stopped, and you've seemed a bit restless lately." "Restless? Distracted, perhaps? Like your mind is elsewhere even when you're engaged in important conversations." The observation was more perceptive than he'd expected, and he wondered if his growing sense of disconnection from his professional responsibilities was really that obvious, or if Margaret simply knew him better than he'd realized. "Maybe a walk would be good," he said. The afternoon air was crisp and clean after the morning rain, and the city looked freshly washed and somehow more vivid than usual. Justin walked south from the Loop without any particular destination in mind, letting his feet carry him through neighborhoods he rarely visited during his usual efficient movements between office, apartment, and carefully selected social obligations. He found himself thinking about his conversation with Ariana the previous evening. They'd been discussing poetry. She'd lent him a collection by a writer he'd never heard of, who wrote about finding extraordinary meaning in ordinary moments. And she'd mentioned something about the courage required to keep looking for your authentic self, instead of settling for whoever other people expected you to be. The comment had stayed with him through the night and into the morning's board meeting, creating a subtle counterpoint to the strategic discussions and financial projections. While Peterson and the other directors talked about market opportunities and competitive advantages, part of Justin's mind had been occupied with questions about authenticity and courage and the difference between being successful and being real. By 4:30, he realized he was walking toward Ariana's neighborhood with the kind of purposeful direction that suggested his subconscious had made a decision his rational mind was still catching up with. The flower stand was busy with the usual late afternoon customers, office workers picking up small arrangements for their apartments, residents selecting flowers for dinner parties or simple gestures of affection. Ariana was helping an elderly woman choose roses for what sounded like a wedding anniversary. Her attention focused completely on understanding exactly what kind of arrangement would best express 60 years of marriage. There was something beautiful about watching her work, about the way she listened and asked questions and used her skill to translate emotions into visual form. When the elderly woman left with a bouquet that had made her face light up with obvious pleasure, Ariana turned to Justin with the direct smile that had become such a welcome part of his daily routine. "Well, if it isn't my favorite corporate refugee, how was your day in the business world? Successful by all conventional measures." That doesn't sound like a ringing endorsement. It wasn't meant to be. She studied his face with the focused attention he'd come to expect and value. "Rough day." "Not rough exactly, just empty. We had our quarterly board meeting this morning, and everyone was very pleased with the company's performance. Excellent numbers, strong strategic position, bright future ahead of us. But sitting in that conference room, listening to all the reports and projections, I kept thinking about what you said yesterday, about the courage to keep looking for your authentic self instead of settling for whoever other people expect you to be. And I realized I'm not sure I know who my authentic self is anymore. I've been playing the role of Justin Adams, successful entrepreneur, for so long that I've forgotten there might be someone else underneath all that performance." Ariana finished arranging a small bouquet of autumn flowers, deep oranges and burgundies that somehow managed to capture the essence of the season in a few simple stems. "Well, you know what I think." "What?" "I think your authentic self is the person who stops by a flower stand every day to have real conversations with someone who treats him like a human being instead of a walking bank account. I think your authentic self is the person who used to play piano and might still miss it more than he's willing to admit. I think your authentic self is the person who's brave enough to question whether his successful life is actually satisfying." The observation was so accurate it took his breath away. "How do you know all that?" "Because that's the person I've been talking to for the past 3 weeks. Not the CEO, not the business strategist, not the eligible bachelor that your family probably wants you to be. Just Justin, who's smart and thoughtful and a little lost, but who's starting to figure out what he actually wants instead of what he's supposed to want." As she spoke, Justin felt something shift inside him, like a door opening onto a room he'd forgotten existed. For weeks, he'd been thinking of their conversations as a pleasant escape from his real life. But what if it was the other way around? What if these moments of genuine connection were actually his real life, and everything else was the performance he'd been giving for so long he'd mistaken it for reality? "Ariana," he said, surprising himself with the sudden decision. "Where would you like to go somewhere with me this weekend?" like a date. Like two people who enjoy each other's company, spending time together away from flower stands and business meetings. She looked at him with an expression of mild amusement. "Are you asking me out properly this time, instead of diplomatically avoiding the word date?" "I'm asking you out properly." "In that case, yes, I'd like that very much." "Good. There's a place I'd like to show you. Somewhere that might help me remember who I used to be before I became so successful." Saturday morning dawned bright and clear, with the kind of crisp October light that made Chicago look like a postcard advertising the virtues of autumn in the Midwest. Justin had spent Friday evening in an unfamiliar state of nervous anticipation, changing clothes twice and second-guessing his decision to take Ariana to a place that held such personal significance. The location was a small cabin on a lake about 2 hours north of the city, a property he'd bought years earlier, during a brief period when he'd thought he might want a retreat from urban life. He'd used it exactly twice in the 5 years since the purchase, and both visits had been working weekends that had defeated the purpose of having a retreat in the first place. He picked Ariana up at her apartment building, a converted brownstone, in a neighborhood that had managed to maintain its character despite the pressures of gentrification. She came down the front steps wearing jeans and a cable-knit sweater that looked like it had been chosen for comfort rather than impression, and Justin felt overdressed in his carefully selected casual wear. "You look nervous," she observed, as they headed north out of the city. "I am nervous." "Why?" "Because I'm about to show you something important to me, and I'm not sure why it's important or whether you'll understand what I'm trying to share." She was quiet for a moment, watching the urban landscape give way to suburbs and eventually to the kind of rural scenery that reminded them both that Illinois was still fundamentally an agricultural state despite Chicago's urban dominance. "Justin, can I tell you something?" "Of course. The fact that you're nervous about this makes it more meaningful, not less. If it were easy for you to share, it probably wouldn't be worth sharing." The cabin sat on a small rise overlooking a lake that reflected the autumn sky like a mirror designed to capture the exact color of October afternoons. The building itself was simple and unpretentious: log construction, wide windows, a stone fireplace that dominated one wall of the main room. It was the kind of place that belonged in a different century, when people built homes to last generations instead of to impress visitors. "It's beautiful," Ariana said as they climbed the front steps. "How long have you had it?" 5 years. "I bought it during a period when I thought I wanted to get away from the city more often. But you don't come here much. How did you know?" "It has that unused feeling, like a place that's maintained, but not lived in." She was right, of course. The cabin was immaculate. He paid a service to clean and maintain it regularly, but it lacked the comfortable disorder that came from actual habitation. It felt more like a museum display of what a retreat should look like than an actual retreat. They spent the afternoon walking around the lake, talking about everything and nothing with the easy familiarity that had developed over their weeks of daily conversations. Ariana pointed out birds he couldn't identify, collected interesting stones from the shoreline, and generally demonstrated the kind of comfortable engagement with the natural world that came from someone who'd learned to find pleasure in simple observations. "You're different here," she said as they sat on a fallen log, watching the afternoon light change the color of the water. "Different how?" "Less careful. Less like you're managing an impression and more like you're just being present in the moment. Maybe that's because I am." "What changed?" Justin thought about the question, trying to identify the moment when his careful self-management had relaxed into something more spontaneous. "I think it's because you're here. When I'm with you, I don't feel like I need to be anyone other than who I am." "And who are you when you don't need to be anyone else?" The question hung in the air between them, more complex than it seemed on the surface. "Who was he?" when stripped of the professional responsibilities and social expectations that had shaped his identity for so many years. I think I'm someone who wants to build something meaningful instead of just building something successful, he said finally. Someone who cares more about connection than achievement. Someone who'd rather have one real conversation than 100 strategic networking opportunities. That sounds like someone worth knowing. As evening approached, they built a fire in the stone fireplace and cooked a simple dinner from ingredients they'd brought from the city. The cabin's kitchen was rustic but functional, and there was something deeply satisfying about preparing food together, sharing the small tasks and casual intimacy that came from domestic cooperation. "Now this is nice," Ariana said as they sat by the fire after dinner, the lake visible through the windows as a dark mirror reflecting the early stars. "I can see why you bought this place. Can you see why I never use it? Because it represents something you want, but don't know how to have." The observation was so accurate, it was almost painful. "Oh, what do you mean?" "This place, this feeling of peace and connection and simplicity, it's what you're looking for in your life, but you don't know how to integrate it with the world you've built for yourself. So instead of bringing these values into your daily life, you keep them separate, like a fantasy you visit occasionally. How do I bring them into my daily life? By making choices that reflect your actual values instead of other people's expectations. By being brave enough to disappoint people who want you to be someone you're not. By deciding that your happiness matters as much as your success." They talked until late into the evening, the conversation moving naturally between personal revelations and comfortable silences. At some point, without either of them making a conscious decision, the space between them on the couch had disappeared, and Justin found himself holding her hand while she traced patterns on his palm with her finger. "Can I tell you something?" she said softly. "Anything. I was wrong about you in the beginning. I thought you were just another privileged guy looking for some kind of authentic experience to make his life more interesting. But you're not looking for an experience. You're looking for a life that feels real. And what's the difference? Experience is something you consume. A real life is something you create. And creation requires courage and commitment and the willingness to choose meaning over safety." The words settled into the quiet space between them, with the weight of truth spoken at exactly the right moment. Justin felt something shift inside him, a recognition that the conversation had moved beyond casual intimacy into territory that would change everything about how he understood himself and what he wanted. "Ariana," he said quietly. "Yes, I think I'm falling in love with you." She was quiet for a long moment, her finger still tracing patterns on his palm while she considered his words. When she finally looked up at him, her expression was serious, but not surprised. "Oh, yeah, I think I'm falling in love with you too," she said, "but I need you to understand something." "What?" "I can't be part of your old life. I can't be the woman who stands beside you at charity galas and business functions, pretending to be impressed by wealth and status. If we're going to do this, it has to be real. It has to be based on who you actually are, not who other people expect you to be. I understand. Do you? Because choosing me means choosing a different kind of life. It means disappointing people who have expectations about what your story should look like. It means being brave enough to build something authentic instead of something impressive." Justin thought about his mother's expectations, about Victoria Thornfield and the other suitable candidates who would fit seamlessly into his existing world. He thought about board meetings and charity galas and all the carefully choreographed performances that had comprised his social life for so many years. Then he thought about the past month of real conversations and genuine laughter and the simple pleasure of spending time with someone who saw him clearly and liked what she saw. "I want to be brave enough," he said. Wanting and doing are different things. Then let me show you I can do it. She leaned forward and kissed him, soft and tentative at first, then with growing confidence as he responded. It was the kind of kiss that felt like a promise and a question at the same time, an exploration of possibilities that couldn't be planned or managed or strategically optimized. When they finally broke apart, Justin felt like he was seeing the world with different eyes. The cabin, the fire, the woman beside him, everything looked sharper and more vivid, as if he'd been viewing life through a filter he'd finally learned to remove. "So what happens now?" he asked. "Would now we find out if you're really ready to choose authenticity over approval?" They drove back to Chicago on Sunday evening in comfortable silence, both of them understanding that something fundamental had changed during their weekend away. The city lights looked different to Justin as they approached the downtown skyline, less like evidence of his success and more like a constellation of individual lives, each containing its own dreams and disappointments and moments of genuine connection. When he dropped Ariana off at her apartment, she kissed him goodnight with the easy familiarity of someone who'd decided to trust him with something important. "I'll see you tomorrow," she said. "You will. And Justin, don't overthink this. Just be honest about what you want and brave enough to pursue it." That night, Justin sat at his piano and played for the first time in years. His fingers were still stiff and unpracticed, but the muscle memory was there, buried beneath years of neglect but not lost entirely. He played fragments of pieces he'd once known perfectly, letting the music fill his apartment with something that had been missing, the sound of genuine expression, unfiltered by strategic considerations or performance anxiety. As he played, he thought about choices and authenticity and the difference between a life that looked successful and a life that felt real. He thought about Ariana's words about being brave enough to disappoint people who expected him to be someone he wasn't. By the time he went to bed, he'd made his decision. The next morning, Margaret noticed immediately that something was different. Maybe it was the way he hummed while reviewing the morning briefing, or the fact that he'd brought her coffee again, or simply the sense that he was more present in his own life than he'd been in years. "Mr. Adams, you seem energized today." "I had a good weekend." "I'm glad to hear it. Your mother called, by the way, about the charity gala on Saturday. What did she want to know? Whether you've reconsidered her suggestion about Victoria Thornfield. Apparently, Ms. Thornfield mentioned you again at some social function, and your mother is interpreting that as evidence of mutual interest." Justin thought about Victoria Thornfield's polished beauty and appropriate background, then found himself comparing it to Ariana's direct honesty and unpretentious warmth. The contrast was striking enough to make him smile. "Tell her I'm bringing someone else." Margaret's expression didn't change, but Justin could sense her curiosity sharpening. "Should I ask who?" "Someone I care about very much." "I see. And should I prepare for complications?" With this decision, Margaret had been managing his schedule and family relationships long enough to understand the diplomatic challenges that came with disappointing Eleanor Adams' carefully laid social plans. "Probably," Justin said, "but some complications are worth it." The rest of the morning passed in the familiar rhythm of meetings and phone calls, but Justin found his attention drifting periodically to thoughts of the evening ahead. He decided to ask Ariana to attend the charity gala with him, not as a way of integrating her into his existing social world, but as a way of introducing his authentic self to people who'd only known him as a carefully managed performance. The decision felt both terrifying and liberating, like standing at the edge of a cliff and choosing to jump, not because it was safe, but because it was the only way to reach the other side. That evening, he found Ariana closing up the flower stand in the crisp October air, her hands busy with the familiar routine of packing away the day's unsold arrangements. You look like someone who's made an important decision, she observed. I have. Good or bad? Terrifying and necessary, she laughed, the genuine sound that always seemed to light up her entire face. Those are usually the same thing. What's the decision? There's a charity gala this Saturday night, one of those formal affairs where Chicago's social elite gather to write large checks and congratulate themselves on their civic involvement. Sounds delightful. It's not, usually, but I want you to come with me. She paused in her packing, her attention shifting completely to his face. As your date? As the woman I'm falling in love with, who I want to share every part of my life with, including the parts that might seem foreign or uncomfortable. Justin, you do realize that showing up at a high society charity gala with a flower seller is going to cause some conversation. I'm counting on it. Your mother isn't going to approve. My mother will have to adjust her expectations. The society pages will have a field day. Let them. She studied his face with the focused attention he'd come to expect and value, looking for signs of uncertainty or second thoughts. Are you sure about this? Because once we walk into that event together, there's no taking it back. People will know that you've chosen something different from what they expected. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. In that case, she said, reaching up to straighten his collar with the casual intimacy of someone who'd decided to trust him completely, I'd be honored to be your date to the charity gala. But I should warn you, I don't own anything appropriate for that kind of event. We'll figure it out. And I have no idea how to make small talk with people whose idea of problems involves which country club to join. Just be yourself. That's all I want you to be. Just myself might not be enough for that crowd. It's more than enough for me, and that's what matters. As they walked toward her apartment building, Justin felt the same sense of nervous anticipation he'd experienced before their weekend at the Lakey, but magnified by the knowledge that Saturday night would represent a point of no return. He would be publicly declaring his choice to prioritize authenticity over approval, genuine connection over social expectation. The decision felt like stepping off a cliff, but for the first time in years, he was excited to see where he would land. Thursday and Friday passed in a blur of careful preparation and growing anticipation. Justin spent Thursday evening helping Ariana find a dress for the gala, an experience that reminded him how different their worlds had become. The boutiques, he suggested, were intimidating to her, their prices astronomical and their atmospheres designed to make customers feel either privileged or inadequate. They finally found something perfect at a smaller shop in her neighborhood, a midnight blue dress that was elegant without being ostentatious, sophisticated without being pretentious. It cost less than Justin usually spent on ties, but on Ariana it looked more beautiful than anything he'd seen in the expensive stores. "And you don't look like you're trying to be someone else," he told her as she modeled the dress. "You look like the most beautiful version of yourself." That's exactly what I was hoping for. Friday brought a series of phone calls from his mother, each more pointed than the last. Eleanor Adams had learned about his plans through the social network that connected Chicago's elite families, and she was not pleased with his decision to attend the gala with an unknown companion. "Justin, darling, I'm sure this woman is lovely, but you must understand how this will appear," his mother said during their final conversation of the day. "The Thornfield family will be there, and Victoria was expecting to see you. You're going to create an awkward situation for everyone involved. Victoria will survive the disappointment, Mom. This isn't just about Victoria. It's about your position in the community, your responsibilities as the head of a prominent family business. People have expectations. Maybe it's time for people to adjust their expectations. Justin, I don't know what's gotten into you lately, but you're making decisions that could have serious social consequences." The only serious consequence I'm worried about is spending my life trying to meet other people's expectations instead of building something that actually makes me happy." The conversation ended with the polite tension that had characterized most of his interactions with his mother since he'd become old enough to make his own choices. Eleanor Adams loved her son, but she loved the idea of what he should become even more, and his recent decisions threatened the carefully constructed narrative she'd built around his future. Saturday evening arrived with the crisp clarity of a perfect October night. Justin picked up Ariana at 7:30, and the sight of her in the midnight blue dress took his breath away. She'd done something different with her hair, still simple, but more formal than her usual ponytail, and she was wearing small pearl earrings that added exactly the right touch of elegance. "You look beautiful," he said as she came down the front steps of her building. "You clean up pretty well yourself." He was wearing his best tuxedo, custom-made and perfectly fitted. But for once, the expensive clothes felt like something he'd chosen rather than armor he'd been required to wear. The difference was subtle but significant. Tonight, he was dressing up because he wanted to look good for Ariana, not because he needed to maintain an image for social consumption. The charity gala was being held at the Palmer House, in a ballroom that had hosted some of Chicago's most important social events for over a century. The cause was childhood literacy, something Eleanor Adams had championed for years, and something Justin actually cared about beyond its social benefits. As their car approached the hotel entrance, Justin felt Ariana's hand tighten slightly in his. "You okay?" he asked. "Just reminding myself that these are just people, despite all the expensive clothes and fancy setting. Just people with more money and stronger opinions about how other people should live their lives. That's not particularly reassuring, but it's honest." They entered the ballroom together, and Justin immediately felt the subtle shift in attention that occurred whenever he arrived at a social event. Conversations paused. Eyes turned in their direction, and he could sense the collective curiosity about his unknown companion. Eleanor Adams approached them within minutes, her social radar having detected her son's arrival with the precision of a heat-seeking missile. She was elegant and imposing in the way that women of her generation and social position had perfected over decades of practice. "Justin, darling," she said, offering her cheek for the ritual kiss, while her eyes assessed Ariana with the thoroughness of a customs inspector. "And you must be—" "Ariana Baker," Ariana said, extending her hand with the same straightforward confidence she brought to every interaction. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Adams." Eleanor shook the offered hand with polite coolness. "How lovely. And how do you and Justin know each other?" "I sell flowers on a corner near his neighborhood. He's been stopping by my stand for the past month." The answer was delivered with such honest simplicity that Eleanor was momentarily speechless. Justin could see her trying to process the information, to fit it into some framework that made sense within her understanding of appropriate relationships. "How interesting," she said finally. "And it has been," Ariana replied cheerfully, either oblivious to or unconcerned by Eleanor's obvious discomfort. Before the conversation could become more awkward, Harold Peterson appeared with Victoria Thornfield at his side. Victoria was everything Justin remembered. Tall, elegant, perfectly groomed, and possessed of the kind of polished beauty that photographed well and never looked out of place at events like this. "There, Justin, wonderful to see you," Peterson said with hearty bonhomie. "And Victoria, of course you remember Justin Adams." "Of course," Victoria said, extending her hand with practiced grace. "Justin, it's been too long." "Victoria, I'd like you to meet Ariana Baker." "Ariana, this is Victoria Thornfield." The two women shook hands with the careful politeness of diplomatic representatives from nations that weren't entirely sure whether they were allies or competitors. Victoria's assessment of Ariana was subtle but thorough, taking in the simple dress, the modest jewelry, the complete absence of the social signals that usually identified members of their shared community. "How lovely to meet you, Ariana. And what do you do?" "I'm a florist," Ariana said simply. "How wonderful. There's something so authentic about working with your hands." The word authentic was delivered with just enough emphasis to suggest that Victoria found the concept interesting in the abstract, but probably impractical in reality. Justin felt his protective instincts sharpen, but Ariana seemed completely unfazed by the subtle condescension. "I enjoy it," she said. "There's something satisfying about creating beauty that makes people happy, even if it's only temporary." "Yes, I imagine there would be," Victoria replied, her tone suggesting that she was trying to be charitable about something she couldn't quite understand. The conversation continued for several more minutes with the careful politeness that characterized most social interactions at events like this. But Justin could feel the undercurrents of tension and curiosity that his choice of companion had created. People were watching, assessing, trying to understand what his relationship with Ariana meant for the carefully established social order they all participated in. As they moved through the ballroom, greeting acquaintances and making the ritual small talk that such events required, Justin became increasingly aware of how different Ariana's responses were from what people expected. She didn't name-drop or reference mutual acquaintances. She didn't demonstrate familiarity with the cultural markers, favorite restaurants, vacation destinations, social clubs that usually formed the basis of conversation in this environment. Instead, she asked genuine questions about people's work and interests, listened to their answers with real attention, and responded with honest observations that sometimes caught them off guard with their directness. "She's not what I expected," Eleanor Adams said during a brief moment when Ariana was engaged in conversation with someone else across the room. "What were you expecting?" "Someone more suitable to your position." "She's perfect for my position." "Justin, she's a florist. She sells flowers on street corners. She's intelligent, honest, kind, and she makes me happier than I've been in years. What else matters? Social compatibility matters. Shared background matters. The ability to navigate the expectations that come with being part of this community matters. Maybe I don't want to be part of this community anymore." The words came out with more force than he'd intended, and Eleanor's expression shifted from mild disapproval to genuine alarm. "You don't mean that?" "I might." "Justin, you can't simply walk away from your responsibilities, your heritage, your place in society. This is who you are." "No, Mom. This is who you want me to be. There's a difference." The conversation was interrupted by the beginning of the evening's formal program, but Justin could see that his words had shaken his mother in a way that mere social rebellion never could. Eleanor Adams had built her identity around her family's position in Chicago society, and her son's apparent willingness to abandon that position threatened the foundation of her understanding of what mattered in life. The dinner proceeded with the familiar rhythm of multiple courses, charitable appeals, and carefully choreographed entertainment. Justin found himself watching Ariana navigate the unfamiliar social terrain with a mixture of admiration and protectiveness. She was polite but not deferential, engaged but not overwhelmed, curious about the people she met without being impressed by their wealth or status. During the auction portion of the evening, a series of luxury items and exclusive experiences designed to separate the wealthy from their money for a good cause, Ariana leaned over to whisper in his ear, "That vacation package to Tuscany just sold for more than I make in 2 years. Does that bother you?" "Not really. But it does remind me how different our worlds are. Are you having second thoughts?" She looked around the ballroom, taking in the elaborate decorations, the designer gowns, the casual display of wealth that would have seemed obscene in her neighborhood, then turned back to him with a smile that was both gentle and determined. "Not about you, but I'm starting to understand what you meant about choosing authenticity over approval. This world requires a lot of performance, doesn't it? More than I realized until I met you. And you're really willing to give it up. I'm willing to transform it, to find a way to honor my responsibilities while staying true to who I actually am." The evening's climax came during the final auction item, a naming opportunity for a new literacy center that the charity was funding. The bidding started at $50,000 and quickly escalated as several prominent families competed for the recognition that would come with having their name on a building dedicated to childhood education. Justin found himself thinking about all the money being spent on recognition and status, about the performative aspect of charity that turned genuine social concern into another opportunity for wealthy people to compete with each other. The cause was important. Childhood literacy mattered deeply to him, but the method felt hollow and self-serving. Without fully planning what he was doing, he stood up during a lull in the bidding. $500,000, he said clearly. The ballroom fell silent. 500,000 was more than twice the previous high bid, an amount that would not only secure the naming rights, but would fund significant additional programming for the literacy center. But instead of sitting down to accept the recognition that such a generous donation would generate, Justin remained standing. "But I don't want the naming rights," he continued, his voice carrying clearly through the silent ballroom. "I want to donate the money anonymously, and I want the center to be named for someone who actually deserves the recognition. A teacher, maybe, or a librarian. Someone who's dedicated their life to helping children learn to love reading, not someone who just wrote a large check." The silence that followed was profound and slightly uncomfortable. Justin had just violated one of the fundamental assumptions of charitable giving in their social circle, that public recognition was not only appropriate, but expected as a reward for generosity. Eleanor Adams looked like she might faint. Victoria Thornfield was staring at him with an expression of polite bewilderment. Harold Peterson appeared to be trying to figure out whether Justin's gesture was brilliantly unconventional or simply inappropriate. But Ariana was looking at him with something that might have been pride, and her expression was worth all the uncomfortable attention he was receiving from everyone else in the room. "That's very generous, Mr. Adams," the auctioneer said, clearly improvising his response to an unprecedented situation, and very thoughtful. As Justin sat down, he could feel the collective attempt to process what his gesture meant. The donation itself was impressive by any standard, but his rejection of the recognition that should have accompanied it was genuinely puzzling to people who understood charity primarily as a form of social currency. "Ubi, that was either very noble or very foolish," Ariana whispered. "Which do you think?" "Both, but I'm proud of you for doing it." The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of congratulations, puzzled questions, and carefully polite conversation. People seemed genuinely uncertain how to respond to Justin's gesture, and he found their confusion oddly liberating. For once, he'd done something that couldn't be easily categorized or strategically analyzed. As they prepared to leave, Eleanor Adams approached them with an expression that suggested she'd spent the last hour trying to decide whether to be proud of her son's generosity or mortified by his social unconventionality. "Justin, what you did tonight was very generous," she said carefully. Thank you. But it was also very unusual. People are going to talk about it. Let them. And they're going to wonder what it means about your priorities. Maybe it's time they knew what my priorities actually are." Eleanor's gaze shifted to Ariana, and for a moment, Her carefully maintained social composure slipped enough to reveal genuine uncertainty about how to handle a situation that didn't fit any of her established frameworks for managing her son's public image. "Well," she said finally, "I suppose we'll all have to adjust to your new perspective." As they drove away from the Palmer house, Justin felt a mixture of exhilaration and nervous anticipation. He'd publicly declared his values in a way that couldn't be taken back or explained away, and he'd done it in front of everyone who mattered in his social and professional world. "So," Ariana said as they headed back toward her neighborhood, "how do you think that went?" "Better than I hoped, worse than I feared. That's probably the best possible outcome for something that's scary. Are you okay with what happened, with being part of it?" She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the city lights as they passed. "Justin, can I tell you something?" "Of course. Watching you stand up in that room and do something genuine instead of something expected, that was the moment I knew for certain that I'm in love with you." The simple declaration hit him with more force than all the evening's social complications combined. He pulled the car over to the curb and turned to look at her, seeing his own feelings reflected in her eyes. "I love you too," he said. "Not just because you accept who I am, but because you help me remember who I want to be." They kissed in the front seat of his expensive car on a quiet Chicago side street, and Justin felt like he was finally living in his own life instead of performing someone else's script. Whatever happened next, whatever social consequences or professional complications arose from the evening's events, he knew he'd made the right choice. He'd chosen authenticity over approval, genuine connection over social expectation, love over convenience. For the first time in his adult life, he felt completely, authentically free. The Monday morning after the charity gala dawned grey and cold, with the kind of persistent drizzle that seemed to mirror the social storm that was gathering around Justin's very public declaration of independence. He arrived at his office to find Margaret waiting with an expression that suggested she'd already fielded multiple phone calls and was preparing him for complications he might not have anticipated. "Good morning, Mr. Adams. I trust you had an eventful weekend. You could say that. The phones have been ringing since 7 a.m. Your mother has called 4 times, Harold Peterson twice, and someone from the Tribune's Society page wants to schedule an interview about your unconventional approach to charitable giving." Justin poured himself coffee from the machine Margaret maintained with the precision of a laboratory technician and tried to process the reality that his Saturday night gesture had generated enough attention to warrant newspaper coverage. "Oh, what did you tell them?" "That you were unavailable for comment and would return calls at your discretion. But Mr. Adams, I should warn you, there seems to be considerable discussion about your decision to attend the gala with Ms. Baker." "What kind of discussion?" Margaret consulted her notes with the careful diplomacy of someone who'd learned to deliver uncomfortable news without editorializing. "The general consensus seems to be that people are trying to understand what your relationship with her represents. Whether it's a serious change in your personal priorities or simply a temporary departure from your usual social circle." "And what do you think they've concluded?" "That they're hoping it's temporary." The morning proceeded with the familiar rhythm of meetings and phone calls, but Justin could sense an undercurrent of tension that hadn't been there the previous week. Conversations were slightly more formal, colleagues seemed to be watching him more carefully, and several people made pointed references to the charity gala with the kind of studied casualness that suggested they were fishing for information about his intentions. During the 10 o'clock staff meeting, his head of marketing mentioned that the company had received several inquiries from local media outlets about his charitable giving strategy, all of them clearly more interested in the social implications of his gesture than in its business relevance. "It's generating positive publicity for the company," she said carefully. But it's also creating questions about our corporate identity and leadership philosophy that we might want to address proactively. What kind of questions? Whether the company's values are shifting, whether this represents a new direction in our community engagement, whether our stakeholders should expect similar unconventional approaches to other corporate initiatives. Or Justin realized that his personal decision to reject social recognition for his charitable donation was being interpreted as a corporate strategy statement with potential implications for everything from investor relations to employee recruitment. The boundary between his private choices and his professional responsibilities had never been as clear as he'd assumed. By noon, he'd received calls from 3 board members, 2 major clients, and his company's public relations firm, all of them expressing varying degrees of curiosity about his weekend activities and their potential impact on the company's reputation. The call that concerned him most came from David. Justin, I just got off the phone with Mom, and she sounds genuinely upset about Saturday night. She's always upset when I don't follow her social script. This is different. She's not just disappointed in your choice of companion. She's worried that you're having some kind of emotional breakdown that's going to damage the family's reputation and the company's stability. That's ridiculous, is it? Because from the outside, your behavior looks pretty erratic. You've been different for weeks. You showed up at the city's most important charity event with a woman nobody knows, and then you made a very public gesture that confused everyone who witnessed it. Justin found himself trying to explain decisions that had felt completely natural in the moment, but sounded increasingly difficult to justify when filtered through other people's confusion and concern. I'm not having a breakdown, David. I'm trying to build a life that feels authentic instead of just successful. I understand that, and I support what you're trying to do, but you might want to consider whether you're moving too fast, making too many changes at once. Some of these people have known you for years, and when someone suddenly acts completely differently, they start to worry about their own security. What do you mean? I mean that your employees depend on your leadership, your investors depend on your judgment, and your family depends on your stability. When you start making decisions they can't understand or predict, they get nervous about what else might change. The conversation stayed with Justin through the afternoon as he tried to focus on the routine business of running a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. The Singapore expansion required his attention, the European division was negotiating a major contract, and the logistics integration was approaching a critical phase that would determine its ultimate success or failure. All important work, all requiring the kind of focused leadership and careful decision-making that had built Adams Enterprises from a garage startup into an international operation. But he found his concentration fragmented by the growing realization that his personal choices were creating professional complications he hadn't anticipated. That evening, he walked to Ariana's flower stand with a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. Their relationship had become the most important part of his daily routine, but the events of the past weekend had reminded him how isolated that relationship was from the rest of his life. She was arranging late-season flowers, deep purples and golds, that somehow managed to capture the essence of November in a few simple stems. The sight of her working with such focused attention always had a calming effect on him, reminding him of values and priorities that felt more fundamental than the social complications that had dominated his day. "You look like someone who's been having difficult conversations," she observed, without looking up from her work. "How can you tell? You have that careful expression you get when you're trying to manage multiple competing pressures. What happened?" He told her about the phone calls, the media inquiries, the growing sense that his Saturday night gesture had created ripple effects he hadn't considered. As he spoke, he watched her face for signs of concern or regret, but her expression remained thoughtful rather than worried. "Are you surprised that people are reacting this way?" she asked when he finished. "I guess I thought my personal life was separate from my professional responsibilities. But it's not, is it? When you're the face of a major company, when your family has a certain social position, when people have invested their money and careers based on their confidence in your judgment, your personal choices inevitably become public statements." The observation was more sophisticated than he'd expected, and he realized that Ariana understood the implications of their relationship better than he'd given her credit for. "Does that bother you?" "It concerns me," she said carefully. "Not because I'm ashamed of who I am or what I do, but because I don't want to be the reason you damage relationships and responsibilities that are important to you." "You're not damaging anything. You're helping me understand what's actually important. But what if those two things can't coexist? What if choosing me means giving up things that matter to you in ways you haven't fully considered?" The question hung in the air between them with uncomfortable precision. Justin had been thinking about their relationship as a choice between authenticity and social approval, but Ariana was suggesting a more complex calculation that included professional responsibilities, family obligations, and the welfare of people who depended on his leadership. "Are you having second thoughts?" he asked. "I'm having realistic thoughts. And one of them is that love isn't always enough to overcome practical obstacles, especially when those obstacles affect other people's lives." They walked toward her apartment in the kind of thoughtful silence that had become comfortable between them. But tonight it felt weighted with unspoken concerns and growing awareness of challenges they hadn't fully anticipated. "Can I ask you something?" Justin said as they reached her building. "Of course. If I told you that I might need to slow down to find a more gradual way to integrate you into my existing life, would you be willing to wait while I figure out how to manage the complications?" She looked at him with the direct gaze he'd come to expect and value, but tonight it carried a note of sadness that made his chest tighten with unexpected anxiety. "Justin, I care about you too much to let you compromise your integrity for our relationship. If being with me requires you to damage other relationships or abandon responsibilities that are genuinely important, then maybe we need to reconsider what we're doing." "I don't want to reconsider anything. Neither do I. But wanting something and being able to sustain it are different things." That night, Justin sat in his apartment surrounded by the flowers he'd bought from Ariana over the past month and tried to understand how the most meaningful relationship of his adult life had suddenly become the most complicated problem he needed to solve. The next few days brought a steady escalation of pressure from multiple directions. Eleanor Adams scheduled lunch meetings to discuss his recent decisions with the kind of diplomatic urgency usually reserved for international crises. Harold Peterson requested private conversations about maintaining stability during periods of personal transition. The company's board of directors began asking subtle questions about succession planning and leadership continuity. Most troubling were the conversations with employees who'd been with Adams Enterprises for years and who genuinely seemed concerned that their CEO was making uncharacteristic decisions that might affect the company's stability. These weren't people trying to control his personal life. They were people whose careers and financial security depended on his leadership. And his recent behavior was generating uncertainty about the company's future direction. By Thursday, Margaret was fielding calls from business journalists who'd heard rumors about changes in leadership philosophy at Adams Enterprises and wanted to explore whether Justin's charitable giving strategy represented a broader shift in corporate values. "The speculation is becoming a distraction," she said during their morning briefing. "And people are spending more time discussing your personal life than focusing on their work responsibilities." "What kind of speculation?" That you're having a midlife crisis that's affecting your business judgment. That your relationship with Ms. Baker represents a rejection of the values that built the company. That you might be considering stepping back from active leadership to pursue a different lifestyle. That's ridiculous. Is it? Because from the outside, your behavior has been significantly different lately. You leave the office earlier, you're less focused during meetings, and you've been making personal decisions that seem inconsistent with your previous priorities. Justin realized that Margaret was trying to deliver a warning disguised as objective observation. She'd been managing his schedule and professional relationships long enough to recognize when his personal choices were creating professional complications. Are you suggesting I need to choose between my relationship with Ariana and my responsibilities to the company? I'm suggesting that you need to find a way to manage both without creating the impression that one is compromising the other. That afternoon brought the conversation he'd been dreading. Eleanor Adams arrived at his office unannounced, sweeping past Margaret's desk with the kind of determined purpose that suggested she'd prepared for a confrontation she could no longer postpone. "Justin, we need to talk." "Hello, Mom." "This situation with the flower girl has gone far enough. Her name is Ariana. I don't care what her name is. I care that you're destroying your reputation and potentially damaging the company's credibility for someone who can never be an appropriate partner for a man in your position." Eleanor Adams had built her life around understanding and maintaining social hierarchies, and her son's apparent willingness to abandon those hierarchies threatened everything she'd spent decades establishing. Define appropriate, Mom. Someone with the background, education, and social skills necessary to support your professional and family responsibilities. Someone who understands the expectations that come with being part of this community. Someone who can represent the Adams family with dignity and grace. Ariana has more dignity and grace than most of the women you'd consider appropriate. She sells flowers on street corners, Justin. She has no understanding of the world you inhabit, no ability to navigate the social and professional obligations that define your life. What happens when you need to entertain foreign clients or attend international business functions? What happens when you need a partner who can hold sophisticated conversations about global markets or cultural institutions? What happens is that I'll have someone beside me who's genuine and honest, instead of someone who's performed the right social choreography. You're being naive and selfish. This isn't just about your personal happiness. It's about your responsibilities to the company, to the family, to the community that has supported your success. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes. With Eleanor presenting a carefully reasoned case for why Justin's relationship with Ariana represented a fundamental threat to everything he'd built and inherited. She wasn't simply expressing snobbish disapproval, she was articulating genuine concerns about practical obstacles and social consequences that could affect multiple people's lives. When she left, Justin found himself staring out his office windows at the city below, trying to understand how the most meaningful relationship of his adult life had become a problem that seemed to require choosing between love and responsibility. That evening, he arrived at Ariana's flower stand to find her packing up earlier than usual, her movements quick and efficient, but lacking their usual unhurried grace. "Slow day?" he asked. "Difficult day." She finished wrapping the unsold flowers with mechanical precision. "Someone came by this afternoon asking questions about us." "What kind of questions?" "A reporter, I think, or maybe a private investigator. He wanted to know how long we'd been seeing each other, whether I understood your position in the community, whether I had any comments about the speculation surrounding your recent behavior." Justin felt a cold knot of anger forming in his stomach. "What did you tell him?" "I told him to mind his own business. But Justin, if people are investigating our relationship, if reporters are asking questions about your personal life, then this has moved beyond private choices into public scrutiny. Does that scare you? It concerns me, not for myself, but for you. Because public scrutiny means that our relationship isn't just affecting us anymore. It's affecting your family, your company, everyone who depends on your reputation and leadership. They walked toward her apartment in silence, both of them understanding that the comfortable isolation they'd created around their relationship was beginning to collapse under external pressure. Ariana, Justin said as they reached her building, I want you to know that whatever pressure I'm getting from other people, it doesn't change how I feel about you. I know that. But I also need you to know that the pressure is real, and it's affecting people I care about and have responsibilities toward. I know that too. So what do we do? She looked at him with an expression that was both loving and heartbroken. I think we need some time to figure out whether this relationship can work in the real world, not just in the private space we've created for it. What does that mean? It means that maybe we should step back for a few days, give you space to handle the professional and family complications without worrying about protecting me from them. Let things settle down enough for you to think clearly about what you actually want and what you're realistically able to choose. The suggestion felt like a physical blow. I don't want space. I want to figure out how to make this work. So do I. But wanting something and being able to sustain it are different things, and right now our relationship is creating more problems than either of us anticipated. Problems can be solved. Not if solving them requires you to damage other relationships and responsibilities that are genuinely important to you. That night, Justin sat at his piano and tried to play away the growing sense that he was trapped between incompatible choices, each of which would require him to abandon something essential to his sense of himself. The music felt halting and discordant, reflecting his internal state more accurately than he would have preferred. He thought about Ariana's suggestion that they take some time apart, and while he understood the practical wisdom of her reasoning, the idea of losing the most authentic relationship of his adult life felt unbearable. But he also thought about his conversation with Eleanor, about the concerns expressed by employees and board members, about the growing speculation that was affecting the company's stability and his ability to provide effective leadership. For the first time since he'd met Ariana, he began to wonder whether love really was enough to overcome the practical obstacles that separated their worlds. The next morning brought a crisis that crystallized all of his competing pressures into a single, always unavoidable decision point. The Singapore expansion, which had been proceeding smoothly for months, suddenly encountered regulatory complications that threatened to derail the entire project. The problem wasn't technical or financial, it was reputational. The Singaporean authorities had received inquiries about Adams Enterprises, corporate stability and leadership continuity, apparently triggered by the business media speculation about Justin's recent behavior and its potential impact on the company's strategic direction. They're concerned that the company might be undergoing internal changes that could affect our ability to fulfill long-term commitments, his head of international operations explained during an emergency conference call. The regulatory approval we need for the expansion is being delayed pending clarification of our leadership structure and corporate governance. Justin realized that his personal choices had created professional consequences that extended far beyond his own life. The Singapore project represented 18 months of planning, significant financial investment, and employment opportunities for hundreds of people. Its failure would damage not only the company's international expansion strategy, but also the careers and livelihoods of employees who had worked to make it successful. "What kind of clarification are they looking for?" he asked. "And do assurance that the company's strategic direction remains stable, that leadership decisions are being made based on business considerations rather than personal factors, and that our corporate culture maintains the professional standards they expect from international partners." The conversation continued for another hour, with various team members offering suggestions for addressing the regulatory concerns. But Justin understood that the fundamental issue wasn't technical. It was whether his personal relationship with Ariana had created enough uncertainty about his judgment to undermine confidence in the company's stability. That afternoon, he received a call from Harold Peterson that confirmed his growing understanding of the stakes involved. "Justin, I've been hearing concerns from several board members about the company's direction and your recent decision-making. People are worried that personal considerations might be affecting your business judgment." "That's not happening. I believe you, but perception matters as much as reality in our business. The Singapore situation is just the beginning. If our corporate reputation becomes associated with instability or unpredictability, it could affect everything from client relationships to employee recruitment." "What are you suggesting?" "That you consider whether your personal happiness is worth the potential damage to the company and the people who depend on it for their livelihoods." The question haunted Justin through the rest of the afternoon, as he tried to focus on routine business decisions while grappling with the growing realization that his relationship with Ariana might be unsustainable, not because they didn't love each other, but because that love existed in a context of responsibilities and obligations that he couldn't simply abandon. That evening, he walked to Ariana's neighborhood, but found her flower stand closed, with no indication of when she might return. He stood on the empty corner for several minutes, trying to understand how the most meaningful relationship of his adult life had become another problem, requiring strategic analysis and careful risk management. His phone buzzed with a text from David. "Mom called me again. She's really worried about you. Maybe it's time for a family conversation about what you actually want and what you're realistically able to choose." Justin stared at the message for a long time, recognizing that his brother was suggesting the same kind of painful reassessment that Ariana had proposed the previous evening. Everyone who cared about him was reaching the same conclusion, that his relationship with her, however meaningful, might be incompatible with the responsibilities and relationships that defined the rest of his life. The thought of losing Ariana felt unbearable, but the thought of damaging the company and disappointing people who depended on his leadership felt equally impossible to accept. For the first time since he'd met her, Justin began to seriously consider whether their love story might be one of those beautiful, impossible things that couldn't survive in the practical world of competing obligations and social expectations. The weekend passed in a blur of solitude and increasingly desperate attempts to find a solution that would allow him to honor both his love for Ariana and his responsibilities to everyone else. He walked through the city for hours, revisiting places where they'd talked and laughed and discovered each other, trying to understand how something so genuine and life-affirming had become a source of conflict and complication. By Sunday evening, he'd reached a decision that felt like emotional surgery performed without anesthesia. Monday morning, he called Margaret into his office and asked her to arrange a meeting with the board of directors, a press conference to address the speculation about the company's direction, and a private conversation with Eleanor Adams to discuss family expectations and professional responsibilities. "Mr. Adams," Margaret said carefully, "are you planning to make an announcement about your personal situation?" I'm planning to clarify my priorities and commitments in a way that will end the speculation and restore confidence in the company's stability. And Ms. Baker? Justin was quiet for a long moment, staring out his office windows at the city that had never looked more grey and unwelcoming. Ms. Baker deserves someone who can love her without compromising other people's welfare. And I need to accept that I might not be that person. The words felt like a betrayal of everything he'd discovered about himself over the past 2 months. But they also felt like the only responsible choice available to someone whose personal decisions affected hundreds of employees, thousands of investors, and family members who had built their lives around the assumption that he would honor the obligations that came with his position. That evening, instead of walking to Ariana's flower stand, Justin drove to his cabin on the lake, needing solitude to prepare for the conversations that would end the most meaningful relationship of his adult life and restore the carefully managed existence he'd been trying to escape. The cabin felt different than it had during their weekend together. Emptier, colder, like a museum display of possibilities that had proven too fragile to survive in the real world. He built a fire in the stone fireplace and tried to imagine returning to the life he'd lived before meeting Ariana, but the prospect felt like contemplating a form of emotional death. His phone rang around 9 o'clock. David. Mom told me about your meeting tomorrow. Are you sure about this? I'm sure it's necessary. That's not the same thing. No, it's not. Justin, can I tell you something? Sometimes the right choice and the safe choice are different things. And sometimes you have to be brave enough to choose what's right, even when it's risky. And sometimes you have to be mature enough to choose what's responsible, even when it breaks your heart. Oh, is that what you're doing? I'm trying to figure out how to be the person other people need me to be, instead of just being the person I want to be. Maybe those don't have to be mutually exclusive. After the call ended, Justin sat by the fire and tried to imagine a future without Ariana's daily presence, without her honest observations and genuine laughter, without the sense of authenticity she'd brought to his carefully constructed life. The prospect felt unbearable, but the alternative, continuing to damage relationships and responsibilities that affected multiple people's welfare, felt equally impossible to accept. By the time he drove back to the city on Tuesday morning, he'd convinced himself that ending their relationship was the right choice, the mature choice, the choice that prioritized other people's needs over his own desires. He was wrong, but it would take the most public gesture of his life to help him understand just how wrong he was. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of bitter November cold that made Chicago feel like a city under siege. Justin arrived at his office early, as was his habit, but instead of his usual focused energy, he felt the hollow exhaustion of someone who'd spent the night preparing to perform emotional surgery on himself. Margaret was waiting with coffee and the morning briefing, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes holding the kind of concerned attention that suggested she understood the significance of the day ahead. "Good morning, Mr. Adams. The board meeting is scheduled for 10, the press conference for 2, and your mother confirmed lunch at 12:30. Thank you. The prepared statement for the press conference is on your desk for review. I took the liberty of emphasizing corporate stability and leadership continuity, as you requested." Justin picked up the document, 2 pages of carefully crafted language designed to reassure investors, employees, and business partners that Adams Enterprises remained under stable leadership, committed to its established strategic direction. Reading it felt like reviewing his own obituary. The board meeting proceeded with the expected combination of relief and subtle reproach. The directors were pleased that he was addressing the speculation about his personal life, but their questions made it clear they'd been genuinely concerned about his judgment and its potential impact on the company's reputation. "This kind of clarification is exactly what we needed," Harold Peterson said after Justin finished presenting his prepared remarks. "Boo. The Singapore situation should resolve quickly once our regulatory partners understand that the company remains focused on business objectives rather than personal considerations." "I'm glad to hear it. Though I have to say, Justin, this whole episode has been a reminder that your personal choices inevitably become corporate statements. Perhaps in the future, you might consider consulting with the board before making significant changes to your social relationships." The suggestion that his personal life should be subject to board oversight was both insulting and depressingly logical. When your individual decisions affected thousands of people's livelihoods, the boundary between private choices and public responsibilities became uncomfortably blurred. Lunch with Eleanor Adams was a masterpiece of diplomatic restraint. His mother was clearly pleased that he'd come to what she considered his senses, but she was also careful not to appear too triumphant about his decision to end his relationship with Ariana. "I know this couldn't have been easy for you, darling," she said over salads at the club, where she'd been a member for 30 years. But sometimes we have to make difficult choices to protect the things that matter most." "And what matters most, in your opinion?" "Family, legacy, the responsibilities that come with the privileges we've inherited. Your father built Adams Enterprises from nothing because he understood that individual happiness sometimes has to be subordinated to larger obligations. Did he ever regret that choice?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment, her carefully composed expression slipping enough to reveal something that might have been genuine sadness. "Your father was a good man who honored his commitments. Whether he was happy, that's a more complicated question." The admission was more honest than Justin had expected, and it forced him to confront the possibility that he was choosing a life path that would provide security and social approval at the cost of personal fulfillment. "But Mom, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you think it's possible to build a meaningful life without taking risks that might disappoint other people?" "I think it's possible to build a responsible life that provides security and stability for everyone who depends on you, whether that's the same as a meaningful life." "Perhaps that depends on how you define meaning." The press conference was scheduled for 2 o'clock in the main conference room at Adams Enterprises headquarters. Justin had held dozens of such events over the years, usually to announce expansions, acquisitions, or other corporate developments. This was the first time he'd ever called reporters together to discuss his personal life. Margaret had invited representatives from the major business publications, the local newspapers, and the television stations that covered corporate news. About 20 people gathered in the room, their attention focused on understanding why one of Chicago's most prominent entrepreneurs felt compelled to make a public statement about his private relationships. Justin took his place at the podium and looked out at the assembled reporters, trying to summon the kind of confident authority that had served him well in countless business presentations. Instead, he felt like he was about to deliver a resignation speech from his own life. "Thank you all for coming," he began, consulting the prepared statement Margaret had helped him craft. "And I've called this press conference to address recent speculation about Adams Enterprises' leadership and strategic direction." He continued reading the carefully worded language about corporate stability, business focus, and commitment to established objectives. The words felt hollow and artificial, like a script written by someone who'd never experienced genuine emotion or authentic connection. "Midday, in recent weeks, there has been discussion about my personal relationships and their potential impact on the company's direction." I want to state clearly that Adams Enterprises remains committed to its strategic objectives and that personal considerations will not influence business decisions or corporate governance." As he spoke, Justin found himself thinking about Ariana, about her directness and honesty, about her ability to see through performance and pretense, about the way she'd challenged him to consider the difference between being successful and being real. The prepared statement continued with assurances about leadership continuity and professional focus. But Justin's attention began to drift to the larger questions that his relationship with Ariana had forced him to confront. What did it mean to live authentically? How much of yourself could you sacrifice for other people's security before you lost track of who you actually were? Mr. Adams, can you clarify whether you're ending your relationship with the woman you brought to the charity gala? A reporter from the Tribune asked. Justin looked down at his prepared statement, which included a diplomatic response about maintaining appropriate boundaries between personal and professional responsibilities. But as he prepared to deliver the scripted answer, he found himself thinking about something Ariana had said during their weekend at the lake. Creation requires courage and commitment and the willingness to choose meaning over safety. "Mr. Adams," the reporter prompted. For a moment, Justin stood at the podium in complete silence, aware that 20 reporters and several members of his staff were waiting for his response. He thought about the Singapore expansion, about his mother's expectations, about the board's concerns about corporate stability. Then he thought about Ariana's laugh, about the way she'd looked at him when he'd played piano for her, about the simple honesty she'd brought to every conversation they'd shared. "No," he said quietly. "Excuse me. No, I'm not ending my relationship with Ariana Baker." His voice grew stronger as he spoke, fed by a growing sense of certainty about what he actually wanted to say. "In fact, I'm here to tell you that I'm in love with her, and that loving her has taught me more about leadership, integrity, and personal responsibility than anything I've ever learned in business school or boardroom." The room fell completely silent. Justin could see Margaret in the back, her expression shifting from professional composure to something approaching panic. Several reporters were scribbling notes frantically, clearly understanding that the press conference had just taken an unexpected turn. "Ariana Baker is a florist who sells flowers on a street corner," Justin continued, abandoning his prepared statement entirely. "And she didn't go to the right schools or grow up in the right neighborhoods or learn the right social protocols, but she's taught me something that all my success and wealth never could, what it means to live authentically, to choose connection over convenience, to prioritize genuine relationships over social approval." He paused, looking out at the assembled reporters and realizing that he was about to make the most important statement of his professional life. "For the past month, I've been trying to figure out how to balance my love for her with my responsibilities to this company and my family. I've been told that loving someone from a different social background represents a threat to corporate stability, that choosing authenticity over social expectation is irresponsible, that personal happiness should be subordinated to professional obligations." His voice grew more confident as he spoke, fueled by a growing sense of clarity about what he actually believed. "But I've realized that the opposite is true. The most responsible thing I can do as a leader is to demonstrate that success without authenticity is meaningless, that wealth without genuine connection is empty, that building something impressive is less important than building something real." The silence in the room was profound. Justin could see some reporters looking confused, others taking notes with obvious fascination, and Margaret in the back making discreet phone calls that probably involved damage control. "So I'm here to make a public declaration," he continued, Not just that I love Ariana Baker, but that loving her has made me a better person and, I believe, a better leader. She's taught me to question assumptions, to prioritize authenticity over approval, to choose meaning over safety. He took a deep breath, understanding that what he said next would change everything about his public and private life. Adam's enterprises will continue to grow and prosper, but it will do so according to values that prioritize genuine human connection over social positioning, authentic leadership over performative management, and long-term meaning over short-term approval. If that makes some people uncomfortable, if that threatens some people's assumptions about how business should be conducted, then perhaps it's time for those assumptions to be challenged. The questions that followed were a blur of confusion, excitement, and attempts to understand whether Justin's declaration represented a corporate strategy shift, a personal breakdown, or simply an unprecedented moment of honesty from someone who'd decided to stop performing for public consumption. When the press conference ended, Margaret approached him with an expression that combined professional concern with something that might have been personal admiration. Mr. Adams, that was either the most brilliant or most catastrophic press conference in corporate history. Which do you think? I think it was the most honest thing you've ever said in public. Whether that turns out to be brilliant or catastrophic will depend on how people respond to someone who's brave enough to tell the truth about what matters to him. By 5 o'clock, video clips from the press conference were circulating on social media with the kind of viral intensity usually reserved for celebrity scandals or political controversies. The business networks were running segments about unconventional corporate leadership. The local news stations were featuring stories about Chicago's most eligible bachelor choosing love over social expectation. And the internet was buzzing with commentary about authenticity, courage, and the relationship between personal happiness and professional responsibility. Justin's phone was ringing constantly, reporters seeking follow-up interviews, business associates trying to understand the implications of his declaration, family members expressing various degrees of concern and confusion. But the only call he cared about was the one he made himself. Ariana answered on the third ring. I just saw the news. And I think you're either very brave or completely insane. Which do you think? Both. But I'm proud of you for choosing to be honest about what you want, instead of just telling people what they expected to hear. Does this mean you'll consider giving us another chance? Justin, what you did today changes everything. You didn't just declare your love for me. You made a public commitment to living according to values that prioritize authenticity over approval. That's not something you can take back or compromise on. I don't want to take it back. Are you sure? Because the man who made that speech is someone who's chosen meaning over safety, connection over convenience, love over social expectation. That's a beautiful way to live, but it's also a challenging way to live. I'm sure. In that case, I have something to tell you. What? I love you too. And I'm ready to help you build the kind of life you described in that press conference, if you're really ready to live it. That evening, Justin drove to Ariana's neighborhood and found her waiting for him on the front steps of her building. She was wearing jeans and a sweater, her hair pulled back in the practical ponytail he'd come to love. And when she smiled at him, it was with the kind of genuine joy that made everything else seem secondary. So, she said as he approached, what happens now? Now we find out whether it's possible to build a life that's both successful and authentic. That sounds like a worthy experiment. Are you willing to try it with me? I wouldn't miss it. They walked through her neighborhood hand in hand, talking about the future with the kind of hopeful excitement that came from people who decided to choose love over fear, authenticity over approval, meaning over safety. The next few weeks brought a whirlwind of attention, controversy, and unexpected support. The business media was divided between those who saw Justin's declaration as evidence of poor judgment and those who viewed it as a refreshing example of authentic leadership. Several major clients expressed concerns about Adams Enterprises' new direction, but others specifically sought out the company because they wanted to work with leaders who prioritized genuine values over conventional expectations. The Singapore expansion proceeded without further regulatory complications. Apparently, the Singaporean authorities were more impressed by Justin's honesty than concerned by his unconventional personal choices. Employee morale at Adams Enterprises actually improved, with several staff members mentioning that they appreciated working for someone who was willing to be authentic about his values and priorities. Eleanor Adams required several weeks to adjust to her son's decision, but she eventually acknowledged that his happiness mattered more than her social expectations. "And I may not understand your choices," she told him during one of their gradually healing conversations, "but I can see that you're more genuinely content than you've been in years." The charity gala had generated enough positive publicity for childhood literacy programs that several other organizations requested Justin's support, not because of his wealth, but because of his demonstrated commitment to authentic philanthropy that prioritized impact over recognition. 3 months after the press conference, Justin and Ariana were featured on the cover of a national business magazine in an article about authentic leadership and the courage to choose meaning over convention. The article became one of the most read pieces in the magazine's history, generating thousands of responses from people who'd been inspired to examine their own relationships between success and authenticity. But the most important change was the simplest one. Justin felt like he was finally living his own life instead of performing someone else's script. 6 months after his press conference declaration, on a perfect spring morning when Chicago felt like a city reborn after its long winter, Justin Adams asked Ariana Baker to marry him. He didn't choose an expensive restaurant or elaborate setting. He proposed at her flower stand, surrounded by the simple beauty that had first attracted him to her work and her way of seeing the world. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, laughing through tears as she looked at the ring he'd chosen, elegant but not ostentatious, meaningful rather than impressive. "But I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Even knowing that marrying me means choosing a life that prioritizes authenticity over approval, meaning over convenience, love over social expectation. Especially knowing that." They were married 3 months later in a ceremony that perfectly reflected their shared values. Instead of an elaborate society wedding at the country club, they chose a small celebration in the botanical gardens, surrounded by flowers and the people who mattered most to them. The guest list included employees from Adams Enterprises who'd become genuine friends rather than professional colleagues, neighbors from Ariana's community who'd watched their relationship develop with affectionate interest, and family members who'd learned to value Justin's happiness over their social expectations. Eleanor Adams served as mother of the groom with grace and genuine warmth, having discovered that Ariana's intelligence and character mattered more than her social background. David Adams delivered a best man speech that brought tears to everyone's eyes, talking about his brother's courage in choosing love over fear and authenticity over approval. But the most meaningful moment came when Justin and Ariana exchanged vows they'd written themselves, promises not just to love each other, but to continue building a life that prioritized genuine connection over social positioning, meaningful work over impressive achievements, and authentic expression over careful performance. As they kissed to seal their marriage, surrounded by flowers and friends and family who'd learned to value substance over style, Justin felt like he'd finally found his way to the life he'd been searching for without knowing it. The reception was held at a local restaurant that served honest food, prepared with care, rather than elaborate cuisine designed to impress. The dancing was enthusiastic rather than elegant. The conversations were genuine rather than diplomatic, and the whole celebration felt like an expression of values rather than a performance of social expectations. Late in the evening, as the party wound down and guests began to head home, Justin and Ariana found themselves alone on the restaurant's small patio, still in their wedding clothes but looking ahead to the future they would build together. "So," Ariana said, leaning against him with the comfortable intimacy of someone who'd decided to trust completely. "What happens now?" "Now we find out whether it's possible to build a business empire and a marriage that both prioritize authenticity over appearance. That sounds like a worthy challenge. Are you ready for it?" "I've been ready since the day you took off that ridiculous tie and decided to be human instead of impressive." As they looked out at the city lights twinkling beyond the botanical gardens, Justin thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a successful but hollow existence focused on managing impressions and meeting expectations, to a life built around genuine connection and authentic expression. The path hadn't been easy. Choosing authenticity over approval had required disappointing some people, challenging some assumptions, and accepting that not everyone would understand or support his decisions. But it had also led to the most meaningful relationship of his life, a deeper sense of purpose in his work, and the kind of daily satisfaction that came from living according to his actual values rather than other people's expectations. Adam's enterprises continued to grow and prosper, but now it did so according to principles that prioritized long-term meaning over short-term profit, employee welfare over shareholder convenience, and authentic leadership over performative management. The company became known not just for its business success, but for its commitment to values-based decision-making and genuine corporate responsibility. Ariana continued her work with flowers, but expanded it into a business that provided arrangements for weddings, events, and corporate functions that wanted beauty created with authentic artistry rather than mass-produced convenience. She also returned to teaching part-time, working with adult literacy programs that allowed her to combine her love of education with her commitment to helping people discover their own authentic voices. Together, they built a life that integrated success with meaning, achievement with connection, and professional accomplishment with personal fulfillment. It wasn't always easy. Choosing authenticity over convenience never is, but it was always genuine, always growing, always rooted in the simple but revolutionary idea that love really could overcome the social barriers and expectations that kept people trapped in lives that looked impressive but felt empty. 5 years later, when business magazines wrote articles about the Adams model of authentic leadership, when young entrepreneurs sought Justin's advice about building companies that prioritized meaning over profit, when couples planning weddings requested Ariana's services because they wanted their celebrations to reflect genuine values rather than social expectations, the success felt secondary to the deeper satisfaction of having chosen to build something real. But the most important measure of their success wasn't professional recognition or business achievement. It was the simple fact that every morning, Justin woke up beside someone who knew him completely and loved him for who he actually was, rather than what he could provide or represent. And every evening, as they sat together in their home, a space that reflected their shared values rather than designer expectations, surrounded by flowers from Ariana's garden and the sound of piano music Justin had rediscovered after years of neglect, They felt the deep contentment that came from people who'd been brave enough to choose authenticity over approval, meaning over convention, and love over fear. Their story became part of Chicago's social mythology, the billionaire entrepreneur and the flower seller who proved that genuine connection could overcome any social barrier, that authentic love was stronger than family expectations or business pressures, that sometimes the most radical thing you could do was simply be honest about what made you happy. But for Justin and Ariana, the real success wasn't becoming a story that other people told. It was building a life that felt completely, authentically their own. On quiet evenings, when the demands of business and social obligations faded into the background, they would sit together in their garden, surrounded by the flowers Ariana grew with the same care and attention she brought to every aspect of their shared life. Justin would play piano while she read poetry aloud, and they would remember the day he'd first stopped at her flower stand, wearing an expensive tie and carrying the weight of a successful but empty existence. Neither of them had been looking for love that day. Justin had been searching for something he couldn't name, some antidote to the hollow feeling that success without authenticity had created in his life. Ariana had been focused on the simple satisfaction of creating beauty with her hands and making customers smile with thoughtful arrangements. But sometimes, the most important things find you when you're ready to receive them, even if you don't know that's what you're looking for. Their love story became proof that authenticity was not just a personal luxury, but a practical necessity, that genuine connection was not just emotionally satisfying, but professionally productive, that choosing meaning over convenience was not just idealistic, but actually the most practical way to build a life worth living. And on the quiet evenings when they sat together in their garden, surrounded by flowers and the sound of honest laughter, they knew that they had found something that no amount of money could buy and no social expectation could improve. A life that was completely, authentically, genuinely their own. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.